At our 30th anniversary cruise dinner, my husband stood up with champagne and announced, "I've been married 30 years, but my heart belonged to someone else for 15. Then he walked to the next table and proposed to my yoga instructor. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. The Mediterranean cruise ship's grand dining room was supposed to be my paradise that night. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over white tablecloths, and the gentle sway of the ocean matched what I thought would be a dance of celebration. I sat there in my navy blue dress, the one Robert had loved when we were young, watching him stand with his champagne glass raised. My heart swelled with anticipation, ready to hear the sweet words he'd surely prepared for our pearl anniversary. But Robert's words cut through the warm air like ice. 30 years ago, I married someone, he began, his voice carrying across the dining room, but I have a confession to make tonight. The room grew quieter, other diners turning to watch what they assumed would be a romantic moment. My heart has belonged to someone else for the last 15 years. The champagne glass in my hand began to tremble. I watched my husband of 3 decades walk away from our table, each step feeling like another year being erased. He stopped at the next table where Miranda, my yoga instructor, sat in a red dress that suddenly looked like blood against the white decor. Robert dropped to one knee, the same knee that had been too bad to kneel when we renewed our vows at 20 years. The ring box he produced wasn't dusty or vintage like our wedding bands. It was new, Tiffany blue, and holding a diamond that caught the light like captured stars. "Miranda, will you make an honest man of me?" The room erupted in gasps and phone cameras, everyone recording my humiliation in high definition. I sat frozen, watching my life shatter while becoming someone else's entertainment. My name is Grace, and at 68 years old, I thought I understood the weight of promises. I had been Grace Evelyn Mitchell before I became Grace Thompson, trading my father's name for my husband's with the naive confidence of a 22-year-old bride. Growing up in small-town Vermont, I was raised on values as solid as the granite mountains surrounding our dairy farm. My mother taught me that love meant sacrifice, that good wives stood behind their husbands, and that family came before everything else. I met Robert at Boston General Hospital where I worked as a cardiac nurse. He'd come in with a construction accident, a broken arm that required surgery. Even with his face twisted in pain, he managed to charm every nurse on the floor. But he chose me, the quiet one who brought him extra blankets and stayed past her shift to make sure his pain medication was working. "You've got healing hands, Gracie," he'd said, catching my fingers in his good hand. 6 months later, I was walking down the aisle of First Methodist Church, my nursing supervisor warning me about giving up my career too soon. But love makes you brave in foolish ways. When Robert started Thompson Construction with nothing but a truck and determination, I became his first employee, unpaid, of course. I answered phones, balanced books, and made sandwiches for his crew while our first baby, Sarah, napped in a playpen beside my makeshift desk. When the business struggled, I worked night shifts at the hospital while managing the company's paperwork during the day. I survived on 3 hours of sleep and the promise that we were building something together. By the time our son Michael was born, followed by youngest daughter Jennifer, I had officially retired from nursing. Robert's business had grown from residential repairs to commercial contracts. We moved from our cramped apartment to a colonial house in Connecticut with a wraparound porch I'd dreamed about since childhood. I planted roses along that porch, red ones for love, white ones for new beginnings. Every thorn that pricked my fingers felt like an investment in our future. My days became a symphony of family needs. Parent-teacher conferences where I explained Robert's absence. Christmas mornings where I wrapped presents labeled "From Mom and Dad," though Robert hadn't seen them. His mother moved in after his father died, and I became her caregiver for 7 years, spoon-feeding her through dementia while Robert signed contracts in Manhattan. When she passed, Robert gave a beautiful eulogy about sacrifice and family values. The congregation looked at him with such admiration. I sat in the front pew, knowing I'd written every word. But I never complained. Good wives didn't complain. They hosted dinner parties where business deals were sealed over my pot roast. They smiled when their husbands missed anniversaries for emergency meetings. They raised children who respected their fathers despite the absence, who believed in the mythology of the self-made man without seeing the woman holding the ladder. I thought this was love. I thought this was the price of a successful marriage. I had no idea I was actually paying for my own erasure, funding the very betrayal that would destroy everything I'd built. My mornings had a rhythm as predictable as my own heartbeat, beginning at exactly 5:30 a.m. when the antique alarm clock on my nightstand would chirp its gentle warning. Robert never heard it. He'd trained himself to wake only to the smell of Colombian coffee brewing, a special blend I ordered monthly from a small roaster in Boston. I'd slip out of bed carefully, tucking the quilted covers around his still sleeping form, and pad downstairs in the same terry cloth slippers I'd worn for 5 years. The kitchen would be dark except for the soft blue light of the coffee maker I'd programmed the night before, already dripping liquid gold into the pot. While the coffee finished brewing, I'd stand at our kitchen window watching the Connecticut sunrise paint our backyard in shades of amber and rose. The bird feeders I'd hung from the oak tree would already be busy with cardinals and blue jays, their morning arguments a gentle soundtrack to my routine. I'd pack Robert's lunch in the same leather briefcase he'd carried for 20 years, always including a note written on cream-colored stationery. "Have a wonderful day, my love," or "Thinking of you always," or "Lucky to be yours for 30 years. Simple messages that I thought mattered, tucked between his turkey sandwich and the apple I'd sliced just before he left so it wouldn't brown. By 6:15, I'd have his clothes laid out on the bedroom chair, every shirt pressed with military precision, creases sharp enough to cut paper. Robert liked his white shirts on Mondays and Wednesdays, blue on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and casual Friday meant the golf shirt from his country club. His shoes sat beneath the chair, polished every Sunday evening while we watched 60 Minutes together. Or rather, while he watched and I polished, occasionally commenting on the stories to show I was paying attention. Breakfast was served at exactly 7 p.m. in our morning room, the small sunlit space overlooking the garden where my roses bloomed from May through October. 2 eggs over medium, wheat toast with just a whisper of butter, 3 strips of bacon cooked until the edges curled, but the center stayed tender. The New York Times folded beside his plate, business section on top. I'd eat my yogurt and granola while he read aloud snippets about market changes or construction industry news, my responses carefully calibrated to show interest without opinion. Our retirement had brought changes to this routine, but only in the details. Robert no longer rushed out for job sites, but he maintained his breakfast schedule with religious devotion. He'd traded construction meetings for golf games, business calls for investment reviews. Tuesday mornings meant his financial advisor. Thursday afternoons were for his old business partners, what they called their board meetings, but were really just excuses to drink scotch and reminisce about deals won and lost. Wednesday mornings had become sacred to me. My yoga class at the community center started at 9 a.m. sharp, and I'd arrive 15 minutes early to claim my spot in the back corner where I could see everyone but remain relatively invisible. Miranda had started teaching the class 2 years ago, bringing an energy that attracted women from all over our suburb. She remembered everyone's name, adjusted our poses with gentle hands, and spoke about inner peace, with the conviction of someone who'd actually found it. I admired her confidence, the way she moved through the world as if she deserved every inch of space she occupied. Friday evenings were for Luigi's, the Italian restaurant where Robert had proposed 31 years ago. We had the same table, ordered the same meals, and Luigi himself would still come out to ask about our children. Robert would have the chicken marsala. I'd have the Caesar salad with grilled salmon. We'd share a bottle of Chianti and talk about safe things. Sarah's promotion at the marketing firm. Michael's twins starting preschool, Jennifer's husband's new dental practice, never politics, never feelings. Never the way Robert's eyes had started drifting to younger women at neighboring tables. Sundays meant family dinners at 4 p.m. precisely. I'd start cooking at noon, the house filling with the scent of roasting meat and baking bread. The dining room table would be set with wedding china and the silver we'd received from Robert's parents. Fresh flowers from my garden centered the table, arranged in the crystal vase my mother had given me. Our children would arrive in waves. Sarah first, always helping in the kitchen. Michael next with his exhausted wife and energetic twins. Jennifer last, apologizing for traffic that didn't exist. These dinners were performances we'd all memorized. Robert at the head of the table, carving whatever roast I'd prepared. Me at the other end, making sure everyone's plate stayed full. Conversations that stayed on the surface like skaters afraid of thin ice. We talked about weather, vacation plans, the twins' latest adventures. Nobody mentioned Robert's increasing absence from family events. Nobody asked why I'd stopped mentioning my own interests, my own friends, my own dreams. We were playing family, and everyone knew their role. This was the life I'd built and tended like my rose garden, predictable, comfortable, and as I would soon learn, completely hollow at its core. Every routine I'd perfected, every tradition I'd maintained, had been a one-woman show. I was both actor and audience in a play about a marriage that had actually ended years before I knew it. The change started on an unseasonably warm Tuesday in March, exactly 3 months before our anniversary cruise. I remembered the date precisely because it was the day after our granddaughter Emma's 7th birthday party, where Robert had seemed distracted, checking his phone every few minutes like a teenager waiting for a text. That Tuesday morning, instead of reading the Times over breakfast, Robert announced he was joining a gym. "It's time I got serious about my health, Gracie," he said, pushing away his half-eaten eggs. The man who hadn't exercised since his 40s, who considered walking from the couch to the refrigerator sufficient cardio, suddenly cared about his cholesterol and muscle tone. At first I was thrilled. His doctor had been warning us about his blood pressure for years, and I'd tried everything to encourage healthier habits. I'd bought him a Fitbit for Christmas that sat unused in his dresser drawer. I'd suggested evening walks together only to be told his knees couldn't handle it. But now, at 70, something had sparked this transformation. He returned from Gold's Gym that first day with a membership card, a protein shaker bottle, and a schedule of classes highlighted in yellow. "The trainer says I need to start slow," he explained, though his eyes held an energy I hadn't seen since his construction company landed its first $1 million contract. The gym visits became religious, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday mornings at 8 a.m. sharp. He'd leave the house in new athletic wear that appeared without explanation. Nike shoes that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Under Armour shirts that clung to his softening frame, compression shorts that made me blush when I moved them from the dryer. Robert had never cared about brands before, content with whatever I picked up at Target. Now he studied himself in our bedroom mirror, turning sideways to check his profile, sucking in his stomach with determination that would have been endearing if it hadn't felt so suddenly foreign. Then came the dietary changes. The man who'd eaten my cooking for 30 years without complaint suddenly had opinions about macronutrients and intermittent fasting, our refrigerator filled with foods I didn't recognize. Quinoa, kale, something called hemp hearts that looked like birdseed. He downloaded apps to track his calories, measuring his food with a digital scale I found hidden behind the coffee maker. When I made his favorite pot roast one Sunday, he ate barely 3 bites before declaring himself full. "The trainer says I need to cut back on red meat," he explained to our confused children, while I stood in the kitchen wondering when this unnamed trainer had become our family nutritionist. It was during the 3rd week of his fitness journey that Miranda entered our orbit more directly. I'd mentioned during my Wednesday yoga class that Robert had started exercising, expressing my joy at this healthy development. Miranda's face lit up with an enthusiasm that seemed excessive for casual interest. That's wonderful, Grace. I offer private training sessions for beginners. I could really help him with flexibility and core strength. Her hand touched my arm, warm and seemingly sincere. Friends and family discount, of course. The offer seemed generous, even thoughtful. What kind of wife would I be to deny my husband expert guidance from someone I trusted? Their first session was on a Thursday afternoon. Robert said he'd be back in an hour. He returned 3 hours later, his face flushed with what he claimed was exertion. "Miranda's incredible," he gushed, dropping his gym bag by the door instead of in the laundry room where it belonged. "She really understands body mechanics. She says I have natural flexibility for someone my age." The compliment rolled off his tongue like honey, and I watched him savor it. When had I stopped telling him he was remarkable? When had my encouragement become background noise he no longer heard? The private sessions increased from once a week to 3 times. They met at various locations. Miranda explaining that different environments challenge different muscle groups. The park for earthing exercises. The beach for resistance training in sand. A studio downtown for hot yoga fundamentals. Robert would return from these sessions transformed, not just physically, but emotionally. He hummed in the shower. He whistled while shaving. He started wearing cologne, a musky scent that made me sneeze, claiming the gym sold it and all the guys were wearing it. His phone, which had lived openly on our kitchen counter for decades, sprouted a password. "Identity theft is everywhere, Gracie," he explained when I couldn't check his calendar to schedule a dentist appointment. He started taking calls in his office with the door closed, something he'd never done even during his biggest business deals. "Gym buddy needs some financial advice," he'd say, disappearing for 20-minute conversations that required absolute privacy. But it was the small betrayals that gnawed at me. The way he'd suddenly stop texting when I entered a room. The credit card statements that stopped coming to the house, now paperless for environmental reasons. The Saturday he said he was golfing, but left his clubs in the garage. The Wednesday afternoon when I drove past the community center and didn't see his car, though he'd said Miranda was training him there. Each incident alone meant nothing. Together they formed a pattern I desperately wanted to ignore, a picture I refused to let develop. After all, suspicion was poison in a marriage. Trust was the foundation we'd built 30 years upon. What kind of wife questions her husband's renaissance, his journey toward health and vitality? What kind of woman sees betrayal in self-improvement? I became an expert in the art of explaining away the obvious. Every strange behavior had a reasonable explanation if I just looked hard enough, if I just trusted deeply enough, if I just remembered who we were supposed to be. Lying in bed at night, I'd construct elaborate justifications for each red flag, building walls of logic against the tide of doubt that threatened to drown me. Robert's new energy wasn't suspicious. It was inspiring. Men his age often experienced renewed vitality when they committed to fitness. I'd read about it in my AARP magazine, hadn't I? The article about 70 being the new 50, about retirement being a second chance at youth. When Sarah called one evening, concerned because she'd seen her father at a cafe downtown, when he'd told me he was at Home Depot, I laughed it off with practiced ease. "Oh, honey, you know your father. He probably stopped for coffee and forgot to mention it. He's been so scattered lately with all these new routines." My voice sounded convincing even to myself. Sarah seemed satisfied, but after hanging up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the phone, wondering when I'd become such an accomplished liar. The Home Depot receipt I found later in his pocket, time-stamped an hour after Sarah's sighting, should have been vindication. Instead, it felt like evidence of my own desperation to be deceived. I started leaving psychology articles about senior fitness on the kitchen counter, creating a paper trail of normalcy. The mental health benefits of exercise after 65. Why older adults need strength training. Social connections at the gym improve longevity. I'd highlight passages and leave notes in the margins, performing the role of supportive wife even when no one was watching. When Robert mentioned meeting Miranda for weekend training sessions, I'd respond with enthusiasm that felt like swallowing glass. That's wonderful, dear. It's so important to have professional guidance at our age. The gaslighting I performed on myself was masterful. When I found a receipt for 2 lunches at an upscale restaurant I'd never heard of, I told myself he was probably treating his trainer as a thank you for all her help. Perfectly appropriate. When he started doing his own laundry, insisting he didn't want to burden me with his sweaty gym clothes, I praised his consideration. When he bought new underwear, designer briefs that seemed aggressively youthful, I convinced myself this was standard gym culture. Everyone probably wore moisture-wicking boxer briefs to prevent chafing. The fact that he'd never complained about chafing in 7 decades was irrelevant. My friends at book club began noticing my distraction. "Grace, you've been on the same page for 10 minutes, Margaret observed during our discussion of Where the Crawdads Sing. I manufactured a smile and blamed it on the new progressive lenses I didn't need. When they asked about Robert's transformation, I became his biggest cheerleader. "I'm so proud of him," I'd gush, my coffee cup trembling slightly. "It's never too late to prioritize health." They cooed approvingly, telling me how lucky I was to have a husband who cared about staying attractive for me. The irony burned like acid in my throat. I even consulted Google, typing searches in incognito mode like a criminal. Is it normal for 70-year-old men to suddenly care about appearance? Midlife crisis in seniors. Signs your husband is not having an affair. I bookmarked articles about the positive effects of exercise on aging marriages, about how shared fitness goals could rekindle romance. I created a Pinterest board called Healthy Couple Goals that I never showed anyone, filling it with images of silver-haired couples doing yoga together, holding hands on beach walks, sharing smoothies after workouts. The mental gymnastics required to maintain my denial were exhausting. When Robert started suggesting I should skip my Wednesday yoga classes because Miranda was too busy with private clients to give me proper attention, I agreed she must be overwhelmed. When he mentioned she was going through a difficult divorce and needed support, I packed her a care basket with tea and bath salts, which Robert delivered because I was too emotional and might upset her further. When Valentine's Day passed with only a generic card clearly purchased at CVS that morning, I reminded myself that after 30 years, grand gestures weren't necessary. We had deeper love than roses could express. My body, however, refused to participate in the denial. I developed insomnia, spending hours staring at the ceiling while Robert slept peacefully beside me, occasionally murmuring words I couldn't quite catch. My appetite disappeared, clothes hanging looser despite no change in routine. Migraines bloomed behind my eyes during particularly elaborate sessions of self-deception. My doctor prescribed anxiety medication after I broke down during a routine checkup, unable to explain why I was crying over a blood pressure reading. "Retirement adjustment is very common," she assured me, and I grabbed onto that diagnosis like a life preserver. The night before I found the credit card statement, I stood in our bedroom doorway watching Robert text someone, his face illuminated by the phone screen and something else, something that looked dangerously like joy. When he noticed me, he didn't startle or hide the phone. He simply looked through me, as if I were a ghost haunting my own life. "Just confirming tomorrow's session," he said, though I hadn't asked. I nodded and returned to the kitchen, where I made his lunch for the next day, wrote another love note on cream stationery, and continued the elaborate performance of being a woman who suspected nothing, knew nothing, and felt nothing but contentment in her perfect, peaceful life. It was a Thursday evening, exactly 2 weeks before our anniversary cruise, when the universe finally forced me to stop pretending. Robert had left for his monthly poker game with his retired business partners, or so he'd told me, kissing my cheek absently while checking his phone. The house felt particularly empty after he left, filled with that hollow silence that sounds like truth, trying to make itself heard. I decided to reorganize the garage, a mindless task that might quiet the growing anxiety that medication couldn't touch. Robert's golf bag sat in the corner where it had been gathering dust since his fitness transformation began. As I moved it to sweep behind, something white caught my eye. A folded paper tucked into the side pocket where he used to keep spare scorecards. My hand reached for it without conscious thought, the way you might reach for a ringing phone or a falling glass. Pure instinct overriding politeness. It was a credit card statement for an account I didn't know existed, bearing only his name, delivered to his office address rather than our home. The charges read like evidence in a trial I hadn't known was being conducted. Tiffany & Co., November 15th, $7,000. My birthday had been November 10th, celebrated with a gift card to my favorite garden center and dinner at Luigi's. The bracelet or necklace or ring worth $7,000 wasn't sitting in my jewelry box. L'Auberge restaurant, multiple charges throughout October and November, always exactly $218, always on Wednesday afternoons when he was supposedly at his financial advisor. The Grand Hyatt downtown, $450 on October 28th. My blood turned to ice water. October 28th was the day he'd attended an all-day construction industry reunion. I'd packed him antacids because these events always aggravated his stomach. I sank onto Robert's workbench, the credit card statement trembling in my hands like a living thing trying to escape. Each line item was another crack in the foundation of my life. Victoria's Secret, $340. The thought of Robert shopping for lingerie made me nauseated. He'd never bought me lingerie, always claiming such gifts were too personal, that I should choose such things myself. A jewelry store I'd never heard of, $900 for something described only as custom piece. Flower delivery services, multiple charges, none corresponding to flowers I'd received. I'd been buying my own roses from the grocery store while he was sending arrangements to someone else. The dates began forming a pattern that matched his schedule perfectly. Expensive dinners on days he'd claimed to be golfing, hotel charges during supposed business meetings with former partners, a weekend resort booking that aligned with the fishing trip he'd taken last month, though the resort was in the mountains, nowhere near water. 2 tickets to the theater for a show I'd mentioned wanting to see, on a night I'd spent alone watching Netflix, believing he was reviewing contracts for his successor at the company. I photographed each page with my phone, my hands steadying as I documented the evidence. This was my nursing training returning, the ability to remain clinical in crisis. Observe, record, assess, don't diagnose until all symptoms are cataloged. I returned the statement to exactly where I'd found it, using my phone's flashlight to ensure the fold patterns matched. Then I went inside and did something I'd never done in 30 years of marriage. I investigated my husband. His home office had always been sacred space, a realm I entered only to dust and vacuum. Now I opened drawers with the careful precision of a surgeon. I found more statements, a second phone charger for a model he didn't own, a bottle of cologne that matched the new scent he wore. In his desk calendar, appointments were coded. FA for financial advisor always corresponded with restaurant charges. GM for golf match, aligned with hotel bookings. PT for physical therapy, though he'd never mentioned any injury requiring treatment. My laptop became a portal to devastating clarity. Our joint bank account showed regular transfers to the private account, modest amounts that wouldn't trigger attention. $500 here, $750 there, described as cash withdrawals that never produced cash. I discovered he'd removed me from 2 investment accounts, changing beneficiaries to a trust I'd never heard of. His email, still logged in on our shared computer, contained confirmations for purchases and reservations. The anniversary cruise I thought we'd planned together had actually been booked as 2 separate cabins. As requested, the confirmation read, adjoining staterooms with private balconies. I found myself in our bedroom staring at his closet with new understanding. The clothes I'd assumed were for the gym were date outfits. The cologne was for someone else's preferences. The password on his phone wasn't about identity theft, but identity protection, keeping me from discovering who he'd become. or perhaps who he'd always been. I sat on our bed, the bed where we'd conceived our children, where we'd whispered dreams and fears, where I'd nursed him through pneumonia 5 years ago, never leaving his side. The evidence was undeniable, each piece fitting perfectly into a picture I'd refused to see. But it was the Tiffany's receipt that broke something fundamental inside me. $7,000 was more than he'd spent on my engagement ring 40 years ago, adjusted for inflation. It was a declaration of value, a measurement of worth. Someone was worth $7,000. Someone was worth secret credit cards and hidden dinners and afternoon hotels. That someone had never been me. The evidence was clear, clinical, and crushing. Dr. Robert Thompson, successful businessman and respected community member, was having an affair, and Grace Thompson, devoted wife and willing fool, had provided the perfect cover by believing in a marriage that had ended long before she'd noticed. The cruise ship's grand dining room sparkled like a jewelry box, crystal chandeliers swaying gently with the ocean's rhythm. We were seated at the captain's table, an honor Robert had purchased for our special night. I wore the navy dress from our 25th anniversary, newly tailored to fit my stress-diminished frame. Robert looked handsome in his tuxedo, the one I'd pressed that afternoon while he was at the ship's gym. Other passengers smiled at us, the sweet elderly couple celebrating 3 decades of love. Robert stood as dessert was being served, his champagne glass catching the light. The room quieted, sensing a moment about to unfold. My heart pounded with conflicted emotions. Even knowing what I knew, some primitive part of me hoped this was all paranoia, that he would toast our marriage and I could forget the credit card statements hidden in my cabin safe. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert began, his voice carrying that commander's tone from his construction days. 30 years ago, I made a commitment. I stood before God and family and promised to love and cherish someone. He paused, and I saw several women touch their hearts, moved by what they assumed was coming. But I must be honest tonight. My heart has belonged to someone else for the last 15 years. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. I watched my hand set down the champagne glass with strange precision, as if it belonged to someone else. Murmurs rippled through the room. Robert wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on the next table where Miranda sat in a red dress I recognized. I'd complimented her on it during last month's yoga class. She'd said she was saving it for something special. 15 years ago, Robert continued, now walking away from our table, each step measured and deliberate, I met someone who understood my dreams, who saw me not as an obligation but as an opportunity. Someone who made me feel alive instead of merely existing. He stopped beside Miranda's table. She was already standing, tears streaming down her face in what appeared to be genuine emotion. "Miranda, my darling, I've lived a lie long enough." He dropped to one knee, his supposedly bad knee that prevented evening walks with me. The Tiffany box appeared from his jacket pocket, that $7,000 purchase now making perfect sense. The ring caught the light like captured stars, a cushion-cut diamond surrounded by smaller stones, exactly the style I'd admired in a magazine years ago. "Will you marry me once I'm free?" The dining room erupted. Phones appeared like weapons, everyone recording this spectacular moment. Flashes went off. Someone actually applauded before catching themselves. Miranda's yes was theatrical, pitched perfectly for the cameras. As Robert slipped the ring onto her finger, she looked directly at me. And in that moment, I saw the truth. This wasn't spontaneous. This was choreographed. Every detail planned to inflict maximum damage. "I'm sorry, Grace," Robert called across the space between us, though his tone suggested anything but regret. "You're a good woman. You deserve honesty. Consider this your freedom as well." The captain approached, clearly uncomfortable but bound by maritime tradition to address the situation. "Sir, if you're planning to conduct a ceremony—" "Tomorrow," Robert interrupted. Miranda and I want to be married at sea tomorrow. It's all arranged." I sat perfectly still as the room spun around me. Waiters stood frozen with dessert plates. Other passengers whispered behind raised hands. One elderly woman at our table reached for my hand, but I couldn't feel her touch. I was watching my husband of 30 years embrace my yoga instructor, the woman I'd trusted with my insecurities about aging, about keeping Robert interested, about being enough. Miranda whispered something in Robert's ear, and they laughed. The sound cut through my shock like a blade. They were laughing. In front of 200 witnesses and countless cameras, they were laughing at the destruction of my life. The betrayal was complete, public, and irreversible. Back in our cabin that night, Robert loosened his bow tie with the casual ease of a man unburdened by guilt. He actually hummed while hanging up his tuxedo, as if he'd just delivered a successful business presentation, rather than detonated 30 years of marriage. I sat on the small sofa, still in my navy dress, watching him with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a dangerous specimen. "We need to discuss logistics," he said, pouring himself scotch from the minibar without offering me anything. "I've already filed the divorce papers. My attorney says the cruise actually works in our favor, international waters and all, makes the timeline cleaner." He pulled documents from his briefcase, the same leather one where I'd placed love notes that very morning. "I'm being generous, Grace. You'll get the house, though you'll need to buy out my equity. I've already transferred most liquid assets to protect them from division." The papers spread across the coffee table like a map of premeditated destruction. Asset transfers dating back 2 years. An offshore account in the Caymans established 18 months ago. The business he'd supposedly sold to his partner had actually been restructured through a shell company Miranda controlled. "She has an MBA, Robert said, noticing my stare. "From Wharton, actually. Online program, but still impressive. She's been managing our investments beautifully." Our investments. The pronoun stung worse than the betrayal itself. Every financial decision I thought we'd made together had been theater. The retirement planning sessions where Robert insisted on conservative bonds. He'd been aggressive with growth stocks in his hidden portfolio. The college funds we'd maintained for grandchildren. Emptied and reinvested in cryptocurrency under Miranda's guidance. The life insurance policy I was beneficiary on. Lapsed 6 months ago, replaced with one naming Miranda. "The children don't know yet," Robert continued, sipping his scotch, "though Sarah suspects something. I've arranged trust funds they can't access until they're 50, ensuring they won't squander their inheritance on emotional decisions." He glanced at me with paternal condescension. "They'll thank me eventually for protecting them from themselves." The house, he explained, was already leveraged through a home equity loan I'd unknowingly co-signed, papers hidden in the refinancing documents from last year. The loan proceeds had purchased an investment property in Florida, titled in a trust Miranda managed. Our joint savings account maintained exactly $50,000, the minimum required to avoid suspicion, while the real money flowed through channels I'd never seen. "Miranda's divorce will be final next month," Robert said, checking his phone. "Her husband thinks she's taking him for everything, but actually she's protected all her assets through the companies we've established. Brilliant woman, really. She understood something you never did, Grace. Marriage is a business arrangement. Romance is just marketing." The conspiracy went deeper than money. Our social circle had been strategically managed. Couples we'd stopped seeing? They'd asked uncomfortable questions. New friends Robert had introduced? Carefully chosen for their discretion or ignorance. The country club membership I thought we'd given up for economy transferred to a different tier where I wasn't included. Even our children's visits had been orchestrated, Robert scheduling business trips when they might have noticed changes. "The cruise was Miranda's idea," he added with admiration. "Public humiliation ensures you won't contest the divorce. Who wants a court battle after being rejected so spectacularly? The viral videos guarantee you'll want this over quickly and quietly." I finally found my voice. "How long have you been planning this?" Robert smiled, the same smile that once promised me forever. Since the moment I realized I was dying inside this marriage, Miranda showed me I could have a second act. You, Grace, were always just the intermission. After Robert left to spend the night in Miranda's cabin, I collapsed onto our balcony floor, the cold metal pressing against my cheek as sobs tore through my chest like earthquakes. The ocean stretched endlessly below, black water reflecting fractured moonlight. And for a moment, I understood why sailors once believed you could sail off the edge of the world. I was living proof that you could fall off the edge of your own life. Every sacrifice I'd made played through my mind like a slideshow of stupidity. The nursing career I'd abandoned when Sarah was born, Robert insisting one parent should be home full-time while never considering it might be him. The night shifts, I'd worked while pregnant with Michael, my feet so swollen I couldn't wear shoes, saving money for Robert's first business loan. The miscarriage I'd suffered alone while Robert closed a deal in Chicago, bleeding in a hospital bed while texting him that everything was fine. Don't rush back. Close the sale. I remembered his mother's final years, the way dementia had stolen her piece by piece. I'd changed her diapers, spoon-fed her pureed meals, sang her the German lullabies she'd taught me, while Robert visited once a month for 15 minutes. "You're so much better at this than I am," he'd say, patting my shoulder before escaping to his office. I'd held her hand as she died, whispering that her son loved her, lying even then to preserve his image. The tears came harder as I thought of our children's weddings, how I'd planned every detail while Robert wrote checks and took credit. "Your father has such wonderful taste," guests would compliment, admiring centerpieces he'd never seen, tasting cakes he'd never sampled. I'd stood beside him, smiling, letting him absorb praise from my work because that's what good wives did. They disappeared into their husbands' shadows and called it love. My phone buzzed with notifications. The video was already viral. Elderly man's shocking proposal to younger woman at anniversary dinner had 13 million views. The comments were cruel entertainment. The wife's face. "Did you see her just sitting there? I would have thrown my drink." Bet she knew and stayed for the money. Strangers dissected my frozen shock, creating memes from my devastation. Someone had made a TikTok remix with music, my heartbreak now a dance challenge. I crawled to the bathroom, catching my reflection in the harsh fluorescent light. The woman staring back was unrecognizable. 68 years old, gray roots showing through the blonde dye I maintained for Robert's. Preference crow's feet etched by decades of smiling through disappointment. When had I become invisible to him? Was it gradual, like erosion, or sudden, like a light switch? Had he ever actually seen me? Or was I always just a function, a role, a convenience? The photo album I'd brought to share at dinner lay open on the bed. Our wedding picture mocked me. Two young people making promises they couldn't understand. I traced my younger face, trying to remember who that girl was before she became Robert's wife. She'd wanted to be a nurse practitioner, maybe open a clinic for underserved communities. She'd loved dancing, reading poetry, growing things. Where had she gone? I found myself on the floor again, this time clutching my knees like a child, keening with grief that felt bottomless. 30 years dissolved into nothing. Every "I love you" retroactively became a lie. Every anniversary was apparently a celebration of my ignorance. Every family portrait was evidence of my delusion. I wasn't mourning Robert. I was mourning Grace, the woman who'd believed she was loved, who'd built her entire identity on being Mrs. Thompson, who'd measured her worth in his satisfaction. The ship's horn sounded, marking midnight. A new day beginning while I lay shattered in yesterday's ruins. Tomorrow, Robert would try to marry Miranda at sea. Tomorrow, millions more would watch my humiliation. Tomorrow, I would have to exist in a world where everyone knew my husband had loved someone else for half our marriage. But tonight, I allowed myself to break completely, to feel every sharp edge of betrayal, to drown in the depth of my loss. Tonight, I grieved the death of who I thought I was before deciding who I would become. At 3:47 a.m., something shifted inside me like tectonic plates realigning. I was lying on the bathroom floor, my cheek pressed against the cool tile, when I heard laughter from the deck above. Robert's distinctive guffaw mixed with Miranda's tinkling giggle, probably celebrating with champagne while I lay broken below them. That sound, their joy built on my ruins, ignited something I'd never felt before. Not rage exactly, but something colder, more precise. Determination crystallized from despair. I pulled myself up, gripping the sink for support, and faced my reflection again. This time I didn't see a victim. I saw a woman who'd survived 46 hours of labor with Sarah, who'd fought insurance companies for coverage of her mother's cancer treatment, who'd learned to manage construction accounts without any financial training, who'd raised 3 successful children while their father built his empire. This woman wasn't weak, she'd just been asleep. My phone showed 17 missed calls from Sarah. I listened to her voicemail. "Mom, I saw the video. I'm so sorry. But listen, Jennifer's husband David says there might be legal options. Call me. And Mom, don't let him win. Don't let him win." My daughter, who I'd taught to be accommodating, to keep peace to support her partner, was telling me to fight. The revolution starts with the next generation refusing to repeat our mistakes. I opened my laptop and began typing an email to Patricia Winters, the divorce attorney my friend Margaret had used. Margaret's husband had tried hiding assets through his medical practice. Patricia had found every penny, plus some he'd forgotten about. "I need your help," I wrote. "My husband has orchestrated a public humiliation to force a quick, quiet divorce. He's been moving assets for 2 years. I have evidence. I'm ready to fight. Send." Next, I scrolled through my phone to find the number I'd saved but never called. James Morrison, private investigator, recommended by my hairdresser whose sister had caught her husband in a pyramid scheme. "Mr. Morrison, this is Grace Thompson. I need documentation of my husband's affair, financial manipulation, and any other leverage you can find. Money is no object." I left my callback number, surprised by the steel in my voice. The ship's safe held more than just Robert's credit card statements. Earlier, thinking I was paranoid, I'd brought our important documents, including one Robert didn't know existed. A legal separation agreement I'd drafted with an online service after finding those first receipts, hoping I'd never need it. But I'd been smart enough to file it with the Port Authority in Miami before boarding, making any marriage ceremony on this ship legally questionable. My nursing training had taught me to hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. I thought about my grandmother, who divorced my grandfather in 1952 when divorce meant social exile. She'd found him with his secretary, packed her children, and started over as a seamstress. "Never let a man convince you that you're worth less than your weight in gold," she'd told me. "And if he forgets your value, remind him that gold prices always go up." I'd thought it was bitter advice from a bitter woman. Now I understood it was survival instructions from a warrior. Robert wanted me to crumble quietly, to slink away in shame while he sailed into his new life. He'd counted on 30 years of conditioning, on my instinct to avoid conflict, on my fear of being alone. But he'd made one crucial miscalculation. He'd humiliated me publicly, thinking it would break me. Instead, he'd freed me from the prison of caring what people thought. When you've been rejected in front of millions, you have nothing left to lose. And a woman with nothing to lose is the most dangerous creature alive. I stood up, stretched muscles stiff from crying, and began planning. By the time the sun rose over the Atlantic, I wouldn't be Robert Thompson's discarded wife. I'd be Grace Mitchell again, and Grace Mitchell was about to teach Robert Thompson that 30 years of underestimating someone could be a very expensive mistake. The morning sun found me showered, dressed in my sharpest outfit, and operating with the clinical precision of my ICU days. My cabin had transformed into a war room, legal documents spread across the bed, laptop open to 17 browser tabs, phone charging while emails poured in. Patricia Winters had responded at 5 a.m., apparently an early riser who specialized in high-stakes divorces. Your foresight with the separation filing is brilliant. Don't sign anything. Document everything. I'm filing emergency injunctions against asset transfers within the hour. James Morrison, the private investigator, had already started working. Mrs. Thompson, Miranda Williams has interesting history. 3 previous relationships with married men, all ending in financial settlements. Her Wharton MBA, 2 courses online, never completed. Her divorce? She's been separated 4 years, never filed papers. Your husband isn't her first mark, but I'll make sure he's her last. I opened Robert's iPad, which he'd left behind in his rush to Miranda's cabin. His hubris extended to using our anniversary date as his password. His email revealed correspondence with his attorney dating back 18 months, discussing Project Freedom. They'd structured the asset transfers to look like bad investments rather than intentional hiding. But Robert, in his arrogance, had kept congratulating himself in emails, creating a paper trail of fraud. The ship's photographer knocked at 8 a.m. I'd requested all photos from last night's dinner, claiming I wanted memories of our anniversary. What I actually wanted was evidence. Every angle of Robert's proposal, Miranda's performance, the crowd's reaction, but most importantly, the metadata proving timing and location. Maritime law was complex, but marriages performed in international waters still required certain protocols. Robert hadn't followed any of them. I called Sarah on WhatsApp. "Sweetheart, I need you to access Dad's office computer. He never changes passwords. Look for a folder called MW Planning. Send me everything." My daughter didn't hesitate. "Already on it, Mom. Jennifer's pulling bank records. Michael's friend at the IRS owes him a favor. We're not letting him do this to you." My children, raised to respect their father, had chosen their side without my asking. The captain agreed to meet me for coffee. Captain Eduardo Ramirez was a traditionalist who'd been horrified by last night's spectacle. "Mrs. Thompson, that display violated several maritime protocols. No marriage can occur without proper documentation filed 72 hours in advance. I've been captain for 20 years. Never seen such disrespect." He handed me a sealed envelope. The ship's legal statement confirming no marriage ceremony can be performed for Mr. Thompson on this voyage. My next stop was the ship's medical center, where I requested copies of my recent anxiety medication prescriptions. The young doctor was sympathetic. "Documented emotional distress caused by spousal actions could be relevant in court," she offered carefully. "I could provide detailed notes about your condition." Medical evidence of the damage Robert had inflicted. I found Miranda at the spa, getting a couple's massage that Robert wasn't attending because he was seasick. "We need to talk," I said pleasantly. She started to protest, but stopped when I showed her James Morrison's preliminary report on my phone. 3 married men, 3 settlements. The FBI might call that a pattern, but I'm willing to forget what I know if you forget what you think you're getting. Her face cycled through emotions before settling on fear. The lunch buffet was serving when I returned to find Robert in our cabin packing his belongings. "Grace, be reasonable. This is happening whether you fight it or not." I smiled, the same supportive smile I'd worn for 30 years. "Of course it's happening, Robert, just not the way you planned." I handed him the captain's envelope, Patricia's injunction notice, and a printout of his Project Freedom emails. "By the way," I added, pulling up a video on my phone, "Miranda's husband would like a word. He's been documenting her affairs for years. Turns out you're number 4, not her first love. Oh, and the IRS received an interesting anonymous tip about some unreported offshore accounts." Robert's face drained of color as he realized his perfect plan was actually my perfect trap. The ship's final night at sea arrived with theatrical perfection, as if the universe itself had decided to stage manage my vindication. The crew had spent all day preparing for the renewal of vows ceremony on the main deck, stringing lights that looked like captured stars against the darkening sky. White roses and baby's breath adorned an altar where the captain would officiate. The irony was exquisite. Robert had planned this as his wedding to Miranda, brazenly assuming he could humiliate me one night and marry his mistress 2 nights later on the same ship where 300 passengers had witnessed my destruction. I dressed carefully in my cabin, selecting a cream-colored dress I'd bought for our daughter Jennifer's wedding. Pearl earrings that had been my mother's. The wedding ring I'd worn for 30 years stayed in the safe. Instead, I wore my grandmother's diamond cocktail ring on my right hand, the one she'd bought herself after her divorce. A woman should always have her own sparkle, she'd said. Tonight, I understood what she meant. Robert had been avoiding me all day, scurrying between his cabin and Miranda's like a rat between holes. The ship's gossip network, more efficient than any newspaper, had been buzzing with updates. Miranda had been seen crying at the pool. Robert had been overheard arguing with someone on the phone in increasingly desperate tones. The crew, who'd initially been shocked by the proposal spectacle, now watched with barely concealed anticipation for the next act. Sarah called as I was applying lipstick. "Mom, we found everything." Dad incorporated 7 shell companies through Miranda's connections. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit is very interested. David says with the evidence we have, Dad could face actual prison time for tax evasion. My son-in-law, the quiet dentist I'd always thought too mild for my firecracker daughter, had revealed himself to be a methodical destroyer of financial fraud. "Also, Mom, we're all flying to Miami to meet your ship. You're not facing this alone." At 7 p.m., passengers began gathering on deck. The crew had arranged chairs in neat rows, creating an aisle down the middle. The same people who'd filmed my humiliation 2 nights ago now positioned themselves for the sequel, phones ready. They didn't know what was coming, but they sensed drama like sharks sensing blood. Margaret from book club had actually flown in by helicopter to the ship that afternoon, claiming she needed to support me. "Grace, honey, I brought popcorn," she whispered, squeezing my hand. "This is going to be better than any novel we've read." Robert appeared at 7:15, wearing the same tuxedo from our anniversary dinner, his face set in determined lines. Miranda walked beside him in a white dress that cost more than most people's cars, her hand clutching his arm like a lifeline. But something was off. Her eyes were red-rimmed, darting nervously. She knew about my conversation with her, about her history being exposed, about the house of cards beginning to collapse. But Robert, in his supreme arrogance, had convinced her to proceed. "Once we're married," I'd overheard him telling her, "spousal privilege protects us from testifying against each other." Captain Ramirez took his position at the altar, his expression professionally neutral, but his eyes twinkling with something that looked like anticipation. He held an official-looking folder, the kind that usually contained marriage certificates. Robert and Miranda stood before him, facing each other, hands joined. The crowd fell silent, even the ocean seeming to hold its breath. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain began, his voice carrying across the deck, "we've gathered here tonight for a ceremony." He paused, letting the moment build. "Mr. Thompson has requested that I perform a wedding ceremony for himself and Ms. Williams." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some people actually gasped, having not heard about this development. "However," the captain continued, and that single word hung in the air like a sword about to fall. I stood in the back row, my phone recording everything. Patricia Winters was watching via FaceTime, ready to object at the crucial moment. James Morrison had positioned himself near the exit, holding an envelope that would destroy Miranda's remaining credibility. But the best part was what the crowd didn't know. 3 FBI agents were sitting among them, waiting for Robert to attempt this fraudulent ceremony while still legally married. Attempting to commit bigamy while under federal investigation for financial crimes was about to become Robert's final fatal mistake. The lights strung above us swayed gently in the ocean breeze, casting moving shadows across the deck like a visualization of shifting fortune. The stage was set, the players in position, the audience primed. 30 years of marriage was about to end, not with a whimper, but with a spectacular explosion that would leave Robert's carefully constructed new life in ashes. The woman he'd dismissed as irrelevant was about to demonstrate that underestimating Grace Mitchell Thompson was the most expensive mistake of his life. Miranda's hands began trembling in Robert's grasp. She could feel the trap closing, even if he couldn't. The crowd leaned forward collectively, sensing that this ceremony would be memorable for all the wrong reasons. The captain opened his folder with theatrical slowness, cleared his throat, and prepared to deliver the words that would change everything. Captain Ramirez held the folder aloft, his voice carrying across the deck with practiced authority. However, before we proceed, there are certain legal matters that must be addressed. He pulled out the first document, the ship's lighting making the paper seem to glow. I have here a legal separation agreement filed at the Port of Miami 3 days ago by Mrs. Grace Thompson, which makes any marriage ceremony involving Mr. Robert Thompson legally impossible until divorce proceedings are complete. Robert's face went from confident to confused. That's impossible. Grace wouldn't. He spun around, searching the crowd until his eyes found mine. I stood up slowly, my cream dress catching the light like armor. Actually, Robert, I would, and I did. You taught me to always read the fine print. I just finally started applying that lesson to our marriage. The captain continued, unmoved by Robert's sputtering. Furthermore, I've been informed by ship security that attempting to perform a marriage ceremony under these circumstances would constitute fraud under maritime law. 2 uniformed security officers stepped forward, positioning themselves near Robert and Miranda, and I believe there are representatives from federal law enforcement who would like a word. FBI agent Catherine Coleman stood up from the 3rd row, her badge catching the light as she held it high. Mr. Thompson, Ms. Williams, we need to discuss your joint financial activities. We have questions about 7 shell companies, 3 offshore accounts, and approximately $4.2 million in undeclared assets. The crowd gasped collectively, phones swinging between the agent, Robert's deteriorating composure, and my serene expression. Miranda yanked her hands from Robert's grasp. You said this was legal. You said the money was already yours. Her voice pitched high with panic. I'm not going to prison for you. She turned to Agent Coleman. I have records, emails, everything he made me do. I'll cooperate fully. The yoga instructor who'd portrayed herself as a spiritual guru was revealing her true nature, a survivor who'd throw anyone under the bus to save herself. You stupid woman! Robert snarled at Miranda, his mask finally slipping completely. Everything is in your name. Who do you think they'll prosecute? The crowd recoiled at the venom in his voice, the same voice that had promised eternal love 2 nights ago. Someone's child started crying, and their mother quickly retreated inside, but everyone else remained frozen, witnessing the complete implosion of Robert Thompson. I pulled out my phone, connecting it to the ship's speaker system with the help of the AV technician I'd befriended earlier. Ladies and gentlemen, in case anyone doubts the premeditated nature of this betrayal, I'd like to share a recording from this afternoon. Robert's voice filled the air, captured by the recording app I'd activated during our cabin confrontation. Grace was always just the intermission. Marriage is a business arrangement. Romance is just marketing. The crowd turned on Robert like a tide changing direction. These people who'd watched my humiliation with entertainment now looked at him with disgust. An elderly man in the front row stood up, pointing his cane at Robert. You're a disgrace, sir. That woman gave you everything. Others began voicing agreement, their murmurs building to angry declarations. James Morrison stepped forward next, handing his envelope to Agent Coleman. Ma'am, you might find this interesting. Ms. Williams has a pattern of targeting married men in financial transition. This is her 4th attempt at this exact scheme. He turned to address the crowd, his investigator's instinct for drama. Her supposed ex-husband has actually been her partner in these cons. He's downstairs in cabin 4012, registered under a false name. Miranda's fake tears turned to real ones. "I want a lawyer," she whispered, but her voice carried across the silent deck. Robert reached for her, whether in anger or desperation, but the security officers intervened. As they separated the former lovers, Patricia Winters appeared on the large screen the crew used for movie nights. I'd arranged a video call for this moment. "Mr. Thompson," Patricia's voice boomed across the deck. "I'm attorney Patricia Winters, representing Mrs. Grace Thompson. As of 6 p.m. this evening, the court has frozen all assets pending investigation. The house you leveraged without your wife's knowledge. That transaction has been reversed. The offshore accounts you thought were hidden, the IRS has seized them. Your attempt to leave your wife destitute has failed spectacularly." But I wasn't finished. Walking to the altar where Robert stood flanked by security, I addressed him directly for the last time. "You know what the saddest part is, Robert? I would have given you a divorce if you'd asked honestly. After 30 years, if you were that unhappy, I would have let you go with dignity. But you had to cruel. You had to humiliate me. You had to try to steal everything we built while painting me as the fool." I turned to address the crowd, my voice strong and clear. 2 nights ago, this man stood in the dining room and declared his love for another woman at what he knew was our anniversary dinner. He wanted to break me publicly. Well, Robert, you succeeded in breaking something. You broke the chains I didn't even know I was wearing. You freed me to become someone I forgot I could be. Someone my grandmother would recognize. Someone my daughters can be proud of. The captain stepped forward, his authority reasserting itself. "Mr. Thompson and Ms. Williams, you'll need to come with security now. The FBI has requested you remain in custody until we dock in Miami tomorrow morning." As they were led away, Robert looked back at me one last time. "You've ruined everything," he spat. "No, Robert," I replied calmly. "I've simply returned the favor." 6 months after that spectacular night at sea, I stood in the kitchen of my Connecticut home, sunlight streaming through windows I'd had professionally cleaned for the first time in years. The house was mine now, fully and completely, awarded by a judge who'd been thoroughly disgusted by Robert's financial manipulations. The mortgage he'd secretly taken out had been reversed, the equity restored, and his name removed from every document. I was brewing coffee, a local fair trade blend I'd discovered, not Robert's pretentious Colombian import, and reading the latest update from Patricia Winters. "Grace, thought you'd enjoy knowing that Robert's plea deal requires him to pay full restitution plus penalties. Your settlement is secured. The IRS fines alone will keep him working until he's 80. Also, Miranda Williams was sentenced to 18 months minimum security for fraud. Her ex-husband got 3 years. Best regards, Patricia." The doorbell rang, and I found Sarah standing there with her 2 young daughters and a box of pastries from my favorite bakery. "Mom, you look amazing," she said, and she was right. I'd stopped dyeing my hair, letting it grow into its natural silver, a color that caught light like moonbeams. The stress weight had melted away. But more than that, I stood taller, moved with purpose, smiled with genuine joy rather than practiced pleasantness. "Grandma Grace, will you teach us to garden?" my granddaughter Emma asked, tugging at my hand. I'd started a vegetable garden in the space where Robert's unused golf practice net had stood. Tomatoes, herbs, squash, things that nourished rather than impressed. "Of course, sweetheart. But first, let me show you something special." I led them to what had been Robert's home office, now transformed into my study. The walls displayed my newly framed nursing degree, photos from my recent volunteer trip to Guatemala with Doctors Without Borders, and a certificate from the community college where I'd started teaching part-time. Introduction to Healthcare for Career Changers, bringing my nursing experience full circle. The desk held applications for graduate programs. At 68, I was considering that nurse practitioner degree I'd abandoned decades ago. Michael had helped me convert Robert's wine cellar into a pottery studio, I'd always wanted to try ceramics, but Robert had called it messy and pointless. Now I spent evenings covered in clay, creating bowls and vases that might wobble, but were entirely mine. The first successful piece I'd made was a coffee mug with Grace carved into the handle. Not Mrs. Thompson, not Robert's wife, just Grace. The book club had become my unofficial support group. Margaret had introduced me to 3 other women who'd survived what she called gray divorces, splits after 30-plus years. We met weekly now, sometimes discussing books, but mostly celebrating our resurrections. Last week, we'd gone salsa dancing, something I hadn't done since college. My hips remembered rhythms that marriage had muted. Robert lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Bridgeport, working as a consultant for his former competitor, the only job he could get with federal fraud charges on his record. Sarah had visited him once, returning with stories of takeout containers and self-pity. He actually asked if you'd consider visiting, she'd reported, incredulous. Said he missed your cooking. We'd laughed until we cried, the absurdity of his request highlighting how little he'd learned. The children had rallied around me in ways that surprised everyone, including themselves. Jennifer's husband David had become like a son to me, his quiet rage at Robert's treatment of me forging an unexpected bond. Michael's wife, who'd always seemed intimidated by Robert's success, now called me weekly for advice. "You're so much more interesting without him," she'd said recently, and I knew she meant it kindly. I'd returned to nursing part-time at a local clinic serving uninsured families. 3 days a week, I drew blood, administered vaccines, and reminded myself that I'd always been more than someone's wife. My supervisor, a woman half my age, told me I was their most requested nurse. "Patients trust you," she said. "You listen like their stories matter." Because they did. Everyone's story mattered, including mine. The cruise video, which had initially been my nightmare, became something else entirely. A young filmmaker had reached out, wanting to create a documentary about women rebuilding after public betrayal. I'd declined but connected her with resources for other women facing similar situations. My story had inadvertently become inspiration for others trapped in marriages where they disappeared. Today was significant, the day the divorce was officially final. The papers had arrived that morning, sealed and sterile, ending 30 years with a notary's stamp. But instead of grief, I felt possibility. Tonight, my children were coming for dinner, not a formal Sunday production, but a casual Thursday gathering with wine and laughter and Chinese takeout on the good china, because why not? I looked at my reflection in the kitchen window, no longer searching for the woman Robert had wanted me to be. The woman looking back had laugh lines earned through genuine joy, silver hair that caught sunset light, and eyes that held hard-won wisdom. Grace Mitchell Thompson was gone. Grace Mitchell had been reborn, and she was, at last, exactly who she was meant to be. My phone buzzed with a text from my new friend Marina, a widow I'd met at pottery class. "Beach walk tomorrow morning? Coffee after?" I smiled, typing back, "Absolutely." Life at 68 was just beginning, and every sunrise brought possibilities that 30 years of marriage had never provided. Freedom, it turned out, looked exactly like choosing yourself after decades of being chosen for. Standing on my porch this morning, exactly 1 year after that cruise, I watched the sun rise over my garden where tomatoes grew heavy on their vines, and sunflowers turned their faces toward the light. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. Things grow toward what nourishes them, and for 30 years, I've been growing in the wrong direction, bending myself toward a sun that gave no warmth. My coffee mug, the wonky ceramic one I'd made myself, held tea now, chamomile from herbs I'd grown, dried and blended. Small changes that meant everything. A cardinal landed on the bird feeder, its red plumage brilliant against the morning sky. Cardinals, I'd learned, mate for life, but if one partner dies, the survivor doesn't waste away in grief. They sing louder, fly farther, and eventually find new reasons to celebrate dawn. Nature understands what I took 68 years to learn. Loyalty shouldn't require the death of self, and love shouldn't cost you your identity. Yesterday, I received an email that would have been unimaginable a year ago. The American Journal of Nursing wanted to publish my article about returning to healthcare after decades away, titled, "The Second Shift Reclaiming Professional Identity After Gray Divorce." My words, my thoughts, my name in print, not as someone's wife, but as Grace Mitchell, RN, a voice worth hearing. The 18-year-old girl who dreamed of making a difference had finally gotten her chance, just 50 years later than planned. The truth about betrayal is that it's often a gift wrapped in barbed wire. It cuts you open, makes you bleed, leaves scars that ache when storms approach. But it also shows you exactly what you're made of. Every woman who's been told she's nothing without her husband, who's been convinced her value lies in her service to others, who's disappeared into the role of wife and mother until she forgot she ever had a first name. We're all stronger than we know. We just need something catastrophic enough to prove it. I think about the women watching this, perhaps recognizing themselves in my story. The wife who notices her husband's new gym membership with the same unease I felt. The mother who's given up every dream to support someone else's ambitions. The grandmother who's been told she's too old to start over. Listen to me carefully. It's never too late to choose yourself. Whether you're 48 or 68 or 88, you deserve a life where you're the main character, not the supporting cast. But here's what I learned that no self-help book tells you. The betrayal isn't really about the affair. It's about the 1,000 small betrayals that came before. Every dismissed opinion, every sacrificed opportunity, every time you made yourself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. Robert's proposal to Miranda wasn't the betrayal. It was simply the reveal of betrayals that had been happening for decades, so subtle I'd mistaken them for love. The wider lesson extends beyond marriage. How many of us betray ourselves daily? We accept less than we deserve. At work, in friendships, in family dynamics. We mistake being needed for being valued. We perform happiness so convincingly that we fool even ourselves. We die 1,000 small deaths before anyone notices we're gone. My story isn't just about a husband who chose another woman. It's about a woman who finally chose herself. If I could tell my younger self one thing, it would be this. Love should multiply you, not divide you. The right partner makes you more yourself, not less. They celebrate your growth rather than fear it. They see your independence as strength, not threat. And if you find yourself shrinking, diminishing, disappearing, that's not love. That's emotional captivity with conjugal visits. My grandmother used to say, when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. But she never mentioned that sometimes the person showing you who they are is yourself. The cruise catastrophe showed me who Robert really was, yes. But more importantly, it showed me who Grace Mitchell had always been. Resilient, capable, valuable, and complete all on her own. The morning light illuminates my laptop where I've been writing my memoir, tentatively titled Third Act: A Love Story. But it's not about Robert or revenge or even survival. It's a love story between me and myself, a reconciliation with the woman I abandoned at an altar in 1994 and finally reclaimed from a cruise ship deck in 2024. Every chapter is a step toward wholeness. Every page a small revolution against the notion that women expire after 60. So here's my question for you. What would you do if you discovered your life was built on lies? Would you crumble quietly, accepting the narrative written for you? Or would you pick up the pen and write your own ending? Would you let betrayal be your conclusion or your catalyst? Would you accept that the best part of your life is behind you? Or would you realize it's whatever part you're living fully as yourself? Think about the relationships in your life. Are you growing toward light or bending toward shadow? Are you the rose in someone else's garden? Or are you planting your own seeds? Are you living a life that would make your childhood self proud, or one that would make her weep? These aren't comfortable questions, but comfort and growth rarely share the same space. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below with your own experiences of choosing yourself, even when it cost everything. Subscribe if you want to follow more stories of women who refused to disappear, who understood that sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of a better one. And remember, it's never too late to stop being who you were told to be and start being who you are. Because here's the ultimate truth. The only person who needs to propose to you, choose you, and promise to love you forever is yourself. And that's a vow worth keeping.